make yourself comfortable. We're gonna sit for a while. If you want a zabuton, there's a lot of them, and you have a choice of colors. If you don't, it's okay. The I would say this: sitting in a chair, make sure that your butt is firmly planted in the chair, and your feet are firmly planted on the floor, and you're kind of sitting enough forward on the chair so that the chair is not somehow attracting you and asking you to sort of slump into it, right? So it's because that will support your upper back and so on and so forth. Yeah, exactly. And if you're sitting on a mat, again, you want or on a zafu, you want your butt to be firmly planted on the zafu, and kind of this interesting thing happens. Maybe sometimes, particularly with these zafus, they're so stiff, and they can press against your sciatic nerve a little bit. So be aware of that. And sometimes I carve a little channel in each side of the zafu to help with that. If you discover your legs are falling asleep, maybe fiddle with that a little bit. And you want to have the down pressure on whatever happens to be touching the floor or the in this case the zabuton, to be kind of even, right? So the in half lotus like this, the down pressure on my knees is pretty even, I would say. It's not perfect. It's when it's really even is when you're in full lotus, right? Which is a great posture, and you can get used to it after. It took me 15 years or something like that, but it mainly has the advantage of keeping your knees pulled in a little bit and really equalizing the down pressure on your legs, right? So, but barring that, if you're sitting like this, that you can have it pretty even. If you're in something like Burmese posture, that's actually quite even. But you'll notice that my knees are further apart, and that puts a little bit of pressure on my psoas muscles. So that's worth noting, right? And then if you're sitting like this, which is fine, right? Just try and find a place where you feel balanced, and where you're not leaning too hard one way or the other. So you can just, using down pressure on your legs, rock yourself right and left. See if you can find the upright balance point in the middle there. Maybe rock yourself forward and backward when you're doing that, use the pivot that's at the bottom of your abdominal musculature. Really rock from your sort of your perineal muscles back and forth, right? So keep everything else straight, and see if you can find the balance point there. And so in the end, you're sitting upright largely because of very light engagement of the largest muscles in your upper body. So the muscles that run up your back, your stomach muscles, and some of the muscles in your upper chest, those are helping you keep upright, but mainly you're upright because you're balanced. So the effort for any particular muscle is not particularly strong, right? Then on top of that, there's the rest of your body, right? So it sometimes makes sense to work a little bit with your pelvic tilt. So tilt your pelvis forward. This works both in sitting in a chair and sitting on a mat. If you tilt your pelvis too far forward, you notice you start to kind of squinch your lower back. If you tilt it too far back, then you get this bowing and you start to feel pressure in your quads, right? So somewhere in the middle, again, is a place where that's comfortable, and that's probably worth finding as well, right? And then this is mostly if you're sitting cross-legged, but it can help to roll your thighs out, right? So try that and see if you can unburden your psoas muscles and your lower stomach muscles a little bit by rolling your thighs out a little bit, right? Um, I'm going to talk about this a little bit more, but there's a place in your lower abdomen, kind of at the bottom of your diaphragm, a couple inches below your navel and right in the middle of your body, that in Japanese they call the hara, right? Or there are other names for it, and I think it's dantian in Chinese, but I could be wrong about that. But anyway, it's kind of the bottom of your breathing apparatus, and it's pretty important in breathing for Zazen. But in addition, you could try imagining that there's a pillar planted there and it's supporting your sternum and lifting your sternum just a little bit. So it's as though your sternum lifts all by itself because there's this pillar, right? And that causes the muscles up here to relax a little bit, and there's this impression like the skin and muscles of your upper back and in between your shoulder blades sort of can fall a little bit towards your the base of your spine, right? And that in turn allows the energy in your shoulders to be sort of out and down as opposed to like this, right? So if it opens the chest and naturally brings your ears in line with your shoulders, and you allow your head to kind of float up off your shoulders so that it's as though the crown of your head is attracted to the ceiling and your face falls into a vertical plane with your nose pretty much right above your navel. So in the Zen school, we sit with our eyes open and our gaze downcast and soft, and also, this is kind of important, very wide, so that if you move your hands out here, you can still see them, right? And there's a whole sort of art in a bunch of therapeutic disciplines, psychotherapeutic disciplines, with looking at the position of people's eyes and using that to infer things about what's on their mind and what their emotional state is and all that sort of thing. And all I can say is this: when you let your eyes settle and you let your gaze open up, not so that it's wide like this up and down, but so that it's wide in the periphery, it has this very particular effect on the mind, and it's sort of calming and clarifying a little bit. So sort of just play with that. Keep your mouth closed and your teeth and lips both shut. Let your tongue rest gently against the front roof of your mouth. Then the hand posture is like this. So you put your left palm on top of your right palm, bend that around in a big circle with your thumb tips very lightly touching, and place it kind of here with your thumb tips, maybe a little bit above your navel, and everything else kind of there. And note that the location of this mudra also reflects a focus on the hara, right? Because it's right in front of it. You can sort of imagine a domain that includes the hara and your mudra, basically. So breathe. Well, okay. Even more specifically, put a little bit of tension in your hara, which is to say your lower stomach muscles and the muscles in your pelvic floor. This is essentially a soft version of yogic ujjayi breathing, right? So you put a little tension there, and then let the breath fall out of the body. And it's as though the breath is falling out of the body into the hara, like there's a stone in the upper chest that slowly drops and presses the breath out into the hara. So give that a try. And then pause. And then when your diaphragm says, hey, breathe in, just let go of the tension. Keep your attention here in your hara, but let go of any tension and just let the breath rush in. And fill the body. You'll almost always discover that when you're on the out breath, if you give a little emphasis to the out breath, there's more breath in you than you thought. And then the other thing that happens, maybe you noticed this too, when you breathe out in this way, it tends to help some of the tension in your upper body sort of collapse into your hara along with your breath, and it can straighten out the kind of temporary deviations in your posture. If you want to do even a little bit more of that, you can imagine that on the in-breath, the breath comes in and climbs up your back, all the way up the back of your neck, over your head, and lands here. And then on the out-breath, it collapses through your chest, down into your hara, and disappears from the body. Only if you want to do that, but it's an interesting thing to explore. So do a few concerted breaths like that, 3 to 5, and then just let your breath take its natural rate and depth and course. But continue to watch it and continue to keep a little bit of attention in your hara, and let that be the vantage point from which you watch your breath. Let's sit for a bit, and then I'll give you some stuff to sit with. So essentially, the request is to always be sitting. Just the the Japanese term that people often use to describe zazen is shikantaza, which is often translated as just sitting, but it would in some ways be more accurate to translate it as always be sitting. It's it's like as much as humanly possible, and that what's humanly possible is actually a complicated question and depends on a lot of things. But as much as is humanly possible to always be engaged with the actual physical process of sitting, of breathing, being upright, being embodied and alive. Typically, thoughts and narratives arise and sort of grab our attention away from the actual activity of sitting. And that's okay. I mean, that's how we are. We're humans. We think, right? But in the middle of even the most involving, active self-narration and planning and all the rest of that stuff, um, our body offers us opportunities to be aware of what's going on right now and to learn to take those opportunities, to really accept them and settle where you are. I think if you do that, what you'll find is that a lot of the discomforts that naturally arise from sitting in a single posture for, as much as 40 minutes or something like that, are less likely to arise because the awareness and engagement is a natural corrective to um, situations where the posture gets difficult because your joints are like, you've been in the same position for 10 minutes. I'm starting to feel like I should transmit some pain signals up the line, right? Mm. That awareness and the natural kind of search for allostatic comfort happens naturally when we're always engaged. Suzuki Roshi, the founder of San Francisco Zen Center, was once talking with Blanche Hartman, who was one of his kind of early students and someone who I knew fairly well. She's dead now, but she was a very important teacher at Zen Center. And she told this story once where they were sitting in a retreat and she made an appointment to see, Suzuki Roshi, and she went in and she said, "Oh, well, everything's going really well. My zazen is really satisfactory and productive. I can stay focused and so on and so forth." And Suzuki Roshi says, "No, you don't sit zazen. It's not your zazen. Zazen sits zazen." And she was embarrassed, but also inestimably helped, right, by that. And it stuck with her for the rest of her life. But what I'd say is your body knows how to sit zazen. It knows how to do exactly this. And if you stay attentive and close to the experience, your body will teach you. How to sit comfortably and quietly for as long as you need to, whenever you need to. It's just a matter of getting out of the way and listening. There's actually nothing to learn. Nothing to teach. And if you discover that you're feeling distracted or it's hard to stay close and listen to what your body has to teach, then maybe it's a good time to revisit the breath. Do maybe 3 to 5 really concerted, mindful breaths. And then let it go and let your breath return to its natural rhythms. Mm. So that's good. So let's stretch a little bit, so because we're going to be here for a little while longer. So I would say let's work a little bit on the head and shoulders. So turn your head all the way to the left. Look over your shoulder. Breathe. And back to the center. All the way to the right. Look over your shoulder. And then place your left hand on top of your head and gently pull your head to the left, and then allow the right shoulder to just relax. So you can feel a stretch all the way along the right side of your neck. This is really hard for me right now. I just had this really extreme surgery on my neck like Friday. Then put your hand under your head and push your head up so that so those muscles that you've just been stretching out can relax, and then do the other side. Pull your head to the right towards your right shoulder and let your left shoulder relax. And push your head up. Now, place your right hand on your left knee. Twist your upper body around. Your upper body should be upright and straight, and your head the same. And then look over your left shoulder again. You can tuck your left arm all the way around behind your back to increase the stretch. And on the other side, put your left palm, cable, on your right knee. Tuck your right arm up around behind your back. Twist to the right, look over your right shoulder. And then back to center. Oh, we have a little bit more time. So take your hands, clasp them behind your back. You can either clasp them up really tight or just clasp your knuckles together. And then lean forward with your back straight. And raise your hands up behind your back to really stretch out your chest. Back up. All right, that's good. So those are stretches you can do before you sit or after you sit, but they generally tend to help, I think. Um, so any questions about any of that, about the sitting, about Zen in general, Buddhism in general, posture, breath, eyes, nose, tongue, body, mind, etc. Any questions at all?
meditation.
Mhm.
Used to having some more instructional, like where my mind should be focused.
Yeah.
It's common in this type of meditation to not be what is the focus.
No, you're totally right. I mean, basically, the the instructions for Zazen, very much like what I just said, were written down in the early 13th century by this guy Dogen, who was a sort of Japanese monk who went off to China and studied there for 5 years and brought at least the Soto school, the school that I'm a part of, the Zen School I'm a part of, back to Japan. He wrote these very explicit instructions, and they say exactly one thing about mental state. They say, and he's not even he didn't even make this up. It's a quote, right? He said that it says, "Think not thinking." How do you think not thinking? Well, non-thinking. And then he's like, this in itself is the essential art of Zazen. And so that's the last thing he says in his instructions, right? And then he goes on to say some other stuff about what you should expect. But what I would say, and so what he did by that was leave it to to later teachers to figure out what to say about that, right? And what I would say is this, right? Zazen has this particular quality that the intention, I mean, sort of as I was saying while we were sitting, the intention is to be as present as possible with what's actually happening now, both in with your broader sensorium, but with the sort of massive quantities of sensation that are constantly arising in your body, and also with your mind. And if you look at the Mahayana Buddhist literature, well, not even the Mahayana Buddhist literature. If you look at the literature that sort of predated Mahayana Buddhism, there's the most popular Buddhist school in the last couple of 100 years before the Common Era was a school called the Sarvastivadin school, which they were kind of, like science of mind people, basically. And they invented this very elaborate and actually quite useful scheme for describing and explaining human subjectivity and the mental processes and so on, right? And in that scheme, you have the world of form, and sensations arise in the world of form because there's contact between things and our sensory hardware, and then out of that arises when something feels important enough, or or pleasurable enough, or whatever. There's a couple of different sort of state variables that control whether a sensation arises to the level of perception or not, and so on, right? But they consider mental activity to be essentially on the same ground as sensory activity or perceptive activity, right? And so they're just kind of like separate data sources. You're seeing, hearing, touching, tasting, proprioception, and your thinking are considered sort of just separate data sources that we're working with all the time, basically. And so in principle, the request in Zazen is to be aware of all of them together, right? What you discover if you do this is that that's not exactly how it works. How it works is that a perception arises, your mind goes to it, and you acknowledge it. There's a kind of moment of activity where there's a little bit of explaining, maybe it jogs a memory and that memory comes out and you're like, oh, it's a bird, right? Or something like that, right? Um, and the same thing with thoughts. And after that moment of recognition, generally those perceptions are just let go. It's like, and then you're in this mode of broad receptive awareness, and then something else comes up, twinge in my knee, right, etc. The same in principle is true for thinking, but our 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 sort of mode of self narration, self construction, planning, all the rest of that sort of stuff that we do with language, self talk, right? All that sort of thing, is so attention grabbing that quite often when a thought arises, there's this erasure, right? And you become unaware of what was happening just before the thought arose, and um, and then you're in this mode of thinking, right? And I think that happens pretty much to everyone that sits. That they kind of alternate in a rhythmic and patterned way between being tangled up in thought and being more or less broadly present, right? And so what I would say is the request of Zazen in particular is to work with that cycle, right? To allow thoughts to arise because you don't really have a choice, right? And to um, to take the opportunities that I was saying while we were sitting are presented even in the middle of thinking, to open the attention and pay attention to what's actually going on. And what you notice is that the transition from being present to thinking is very hard, I would say impossible to catch, right? You don't see it. But the transition back the other way, everything is visible, right? The thought, the emotions that went with the thought, the physical sensations that are associated with those emotions, and the whole sensory picture, the whole embodied picture is there. And so to settle in the midst of that and watch what happens next, that's the cycle, right? And over time, if you practice with that, what happens is you start to realize that both of those modes of thinking, of rumination, self-construction, et cetera, that mode and the mode of sort of broad, unloaded, receptive attention are present continuously, right? And they're not mutually exclusive, right? And so it gets what starts to arise is this capacity to have the attention move smoothly from one to the other without being absorbed, basically, right? And so that's the kind of long game, I think, in Zazen. Does that help? Or
There are a number of pieces in there that were helpful. There were some that were a little confusing.
okay, what parts were confusing?
I'm not sure I could even describe.
Okay, well, good. I'm glad. Yeah, yeah.
I think what I'm hearing is, well, I mean, it's super interesting to think about the directionality, like the awareness of the changing of thought.
Yeah.
When that thought comes in, that, like the way you described it, of in one direction, you know that you can't identify the moment that things change.
Right.
In the other direction, you can actually see it all sort of change.
Yeah, exactly.
And
Yeah.
I'm very aware of.
Yeah, nice.
And so it's kind of helpful. What I find the most useful about what you described is a very analytical way in which you're describing the patterns of thinking,
Yeah.
and sort of classifying them, which is I can really relate to.
Cool. Yeah, that's good. Yeah, I mean, and like I said, in the end, the more stuff becomes possible. And I guess the meta point is, we live our entire life in practice, in this tangle between essentially those two modes. They're called lots of different things. So, if you read Zen Mind, Beginner's Mind by Suzuki Roshi, he calls them big mind and conventional mind or something like that, or big mind and small mind. If you read, there's a famous poem by the founder of this of the Soto Zen School in China during the Tang Dynasty, a guy named Dongshan. He may not have actually written this poem, but it's usually attributed to him. He calls them the crooked and the straight, or maybe the leaning and upright, right? Right? So there are these two kind of modes of being, right? And we live our entire life generally, and in specifically our entire life in practice, in the tangle between those two modes, right? And the activity of one influences and is influenced by the activity of the other, right? And so, everyone, I think, has had this experience of sitting zazen, and all of a sudden everything gets really quiet, or something really surprising happens, and there's this moment where it's just nothing but surprise or delight or whatever, and then the next moment your mind is like, well, what was that? And you're off thinking again. I have this wonderful friend who lived at our monastery in the Fintahena wilderness for a long time, and she said she was out walking, and she walked by the garden, and there was this flower that was just arrestingly beautiful, and she looked at it, and her kind of mind opened up, and she started to cry, and there was this moment where everything was kind of great, and then in the back of her mind, this voice spoke up, and it said, literally in air quotes, it said, and she was moved to tears. and then, like a second or so later, this other voice speaks up and goes, there you go, commenting on your experience again. You ruin everything. And it's sort of, so to go from that tangle leads you to go from sort of transcendent engagement to self-punishing grumpiness within seconds, right? It's amazing, actually. But to learn to live comfortably and skillfully in that tangle is the request of practice, and in particular zazen. Yeah. Anyway, something like that. Anything else? What time is it? Well, I was gonna give a short talk, and it's on a koan, and I also wrote a poem about it, so I thought I'd read the poem too. But let me get the case out. So Wangbo, who's this famous Zen master, was giving a talk, and he says, all of you monks are like gobblers of dregs. In other words, like like you look at a bowl of rice gruel, you serve it all up, and at the bottom there's just this sort of slime in the bottom of the pot, right? And they're slurping up the slime, right? And he says, if you go on traveling around like this, where will you find today, with a capital T, right? Well, obviously it didn't have a capital T in Chinese, but he says, do you know that there's no teachers of Zen in China? And a monk gets up and he goes, but what about these monasteries with these guys that live there and give talks and stuff like that? And Wangbo says, no, wait a second. I didn't say there was no Zen. I just said there's no teachers. So maybe I'll say a thing or two and then read the poem. So there was a practice back in the day in Tang Dynasty China where the idea in Japanese it's called henzan. The idea was that you would study with a teacher, and then after a certain point you'd go get essentially a second opinion, and the going and getting a second opinion would involve putting on a pair of straw sandals and walking like 800 miles and going to another teacher in another province, basically, on another mountain. And all of the monks well, not all, but a lot of the monks in Tang Dynasty China were going around visiting various teachers and sort of picking up the teaching from them, right? And that was good, right? But you can imagine that it also had its difficulties, right? It's easy. Everybody knows what this is like, right? It's easy to when you're studying something and it gets difficult, it's easy to go, well, maybe I need to go somewhere else, right? And it's easy to be to get tangled up with the particular teaching style of an individual teacher, and then moving on to another teacher, think, oh, that stuff was all wrong. This is the right way, right? All of that stuff can be problematic, right? And maybe you might even find yourself thinking, well, after I've gone to visit this guy, everything will be great, right? Yeah. So that's part of Wangbo's criticism, right? And then the other part is this, and this is in some ways the even more significant part. Like I was saying earlier, your body and mind know how to do this, right? It's not something that by talking and reading and thinking about you can get again, because your cognitive faculties are entangled with your experiential the quality of your experience. You can by using cognition and using practice, you can navigate in a particular direction, and that's good. But in the end, everyone's practice is singularly and uniquely their own. And the funny thing about the literature that this story is drawn from is that the teachers in the literature are always calling each other thieves, right? Because basically what you're doing when you're teaching somebody, and here I go, right, is you're reaching into their mind and you're taking out a piece of it, and their original perfectly reasonable mind, and replacing it with something else that may or may not fit at all, right? And certainly for me, all of the times I've really gotten myself into trouble have been when I've gone to hear a Dharma talk, usually by my teacher, who I admire greatly, and he'll say something, and I'll be like, yes, that is how it should be. And I go spend months trying to apply it, and of course, beating my head against a wall, and discovering that doing it that way doesn't work, right? It's like there to navigate in this domain, you have to be able to hold the ideas, whether they sound great and you get them from somebody you admire, or whether they only sound so. In any case, hold them lightly and and allow them to help, but not get in the way of letting your own body and mind teach you how to practice. Right? So here, I'll read this poem, and then if you have any questions, we can talk about them, or maybe we'll just sit a little more. So the poem is: always arriving late for breakfast and charging off headlong before lunch. Even the disappointment is bland and disappointing. A shelf sagging under the weight of all those books and the magazines. And why not burn them? And while you're at it, those chairs, serried ranks, thousands of them set up on stage. What, Siri wants to talk? No. Serried ranks, thousands of them set up on stage, all suddenly empty, just when you least expect it. Anyway, that's the poem. So, any questions about Wang Bo? Awesome. Let's sit for 10 more minutes. Each of us has a unique position in space and time, and an utterly unique path through space and time. Mm. And our activity engages with and influences the world in a way that's utterly unprecedented and never to be repeated. Just to appreciate the miraculous uniqueness of this body and mind and the way it moves and works. It's like waves crashing on a shore. Enjoy the sound, the smell, the taste, the touch. Just to enjoy the thoughts and emotions, the caring and concern that drives them. All of that. Just to be, to have an unconditioned appreciation for the fact and act of being alive. Well, thanks so much for coming and for sitting. I appreciate it.